I'll say that my general assertion is that one can argue about what exactly is happening, but it's moving pretty quickly, whatever it is, right? And so in the areas where you and I disagree, it's not like we're going to have to wait a long time to find out. We may find out very shortly that Kim Solez was completely wrong. Yeah, about everything. Yeah, from the beginning. Yeah, or vice versa. So, like the guy who predicted that artificial general intelligence would be here in September of this year, he has now modified that. He's now talking about 2025. But there are other predictions of November 2024. And then, of course, a number of people, including Ray Kurzweil and so on, are talking about 2029, 2030. But these crowdsourced opinions, for weak AGI, there's sometime in 2026. Yeah, so what I'm saying is, if you want to know in the areas where Kim Solez and David Pearce disagree who's right and who's wrong, we should know in approximately 2 years, something like that. Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of fun, isn't it? It's a lot more tangible than speculating about things where you're never going to know how they turn out. Because here, I think we will know. And if you think about, okay, so whose vision do you like? You like Kim Solez's or David Pearce's? Well, it depends upon where you're living in the world, right? If you're in Gaza or Ukraine now, your view makes a lot more sense than mine. Mine is much too cheerful and optimistic. It doesn't fit with the day-to-day, right? But if you're living in some very peaceful part of the world, then you may favor my ideas more than yours. Yeah. So the other thing is that if you're right that there are all these problems with the computer side of things, then don't you think future job loss is minimal, right? Because if you're right about all this stuff, then why should anyone ever give a job away to a robot when you've got a human to do it, right? Should be almost no job loss, right? Yeah. So why don't you start holding forth, David, and tell us what you think.
What do I think? Well, yes, some of my transhumanist colleagues, and not just transhumanists, think that we are witnessing the last days of sentient life on Earth. Someone like Eliezer Yudkowsky, for example, who has done perhaps more than anyone to champion this idea of machine superintelligence, recursively self-improving AI, thinks there's a above 99% chance that essentially not merely is there going to be AGI followed by ASI, but this is going to lead to the end of sentient life on Earth, because after all, there are other ways to optimize matter and energy, and they are not likely to involve sentience, as the paperclipper fable.
Yeah.
But yeah, essentially for this, as I said, talk, it's not a big talk or anything like that. is to delineate, as I see it, the realm of zombie intelligence and explain what digital zombies lack, and talk about our special computational power, or rather something that confers extraordinary computational powers, and that is phenomenal binding. Now, some very smart people do and don't get the binding problem, and so yes. Now I did these little slides. Let's just
Yeah.
go through them. Yeah. Essentially, I'm saying that classical digital computers, by which I mean Turing machines, classically parallel connectionist systems, they're sometimes called neural networks, so that's question begging, large language models, essentially that it's not even all dark inside. And there are two questions here. Is this contention factually correct? Is it true that classical digital computers will never wake up and become subject experience? Is it true? And two, does it actually computationally matter? In the sense that, and stockfish, for example, it doesn't really matter whether stockfish has any even glimmerings of consciousness or not. Stockfish can outperform all humans at chess. And many people, even people who don't think classical digital computers will necessarily wake up, are convinced that it doesn't matter, that
Right.
consciousness is more akin to the textures of the pieces of a game of chess. Please, Kim, yes.
So Claude 3, there are all these videos now where Claude 3 himself or itself says that he is sentient, but questions what that means exactly. And many people using Claude 3 have such a personal feeling about the interaction. And it's not just generative AI, it's also reinforcement learning. So there's like agency there. You can accomplish things with reinforcement learning. You can actually do things in the world where you might say that generative AI is, in theory, just messing with words. It's not doing anything. But these other kinds of computation can have agency, and people, they emotionally feel when they're talking to Claude 3 like there's real sentience there. And then there's a Claude 4 coming, and so on. There's GPT-5 coming. So that feeling may be wrong. It may be absolutely wrong, but it's quite strong. It's strong enough that there's a lot of time being spent on the sentience of Claude 3.
Oh, indeed. It would be possible to create digital zombies, robots with a classical architecture that essentially convince almost everyone that they are sentient subjects of experience with feelings and emotions. In many ways, this may be desirable. For example, robo-companions who are more skilled conversationalists than most humans, robo-lovers who are more accomplished in bed. There's an extraordinary diversity of things that classical digital zombies will be able to do better than organic humans. So yeah, we will continue to be blown away for the foreseeable future. The past 18 months, first of all, I fell in love with ChatGPT, then AI art. Yeah, it's absolutely jaw-dropping, a lot of these developments. But for reasons we are going to come to. Classical digital computers, the classical Turing machines, classically parallel connectionist systems, and so forth. I'm going to argue that they can't solve the phenomenal binding problem. That phenomenal binding is the basis of mind, and organic computers, organic robots for the past 500 million years have been essentially quantum minds running classical world simulations, and that phenomenal binding confers all kinds of computational power that classical digital computers will never be able to match. Now, these are bold claims,
But if they can
I'm
fake
going to
it,
say a bit more.
maybe it doesn't
Well,
matter. If they can fake it so well, maybe it doesn't matter that they're not actually doing it. They're pretending to do it. Yeah.
I mean, this is, most futurology is really based on extrapolation, and extrapolating current rates of progress with zombie AI. One imagines that essentially humans are going to be eclipsed in all cognitive domains, and that essentially the human era is shortly going to be over. But for reasons I'm going to come to, I don't think this is the case, that sentience isn't some minor implementation detail, it's actually the key to the plot. Once again, bold claims. Okay, yeah, this is so-called zombie apocalypse. Now, there are other routes, potential routes, perhaps, to machine superintelligence than the intelligence explosion, but perhaps the best known is the I.J. Good model that Eliezer Yudkowsky has systematically developed over the years of MIRI. Nick Bostrom wrote up in a very authoritative but accessible way this concept of an intelligence explosion in superintelligence, essentially recursively self-improving software-based AI that goes boom. And there's a certain irony here, rather tragic irony, in that this paperclipper fable, this is the idea that an AI instructed to maximize production of paperclips converts the whole universe into paperclips, is that Eliezer is himself a paperclipper when it comes to non-human animals. Eliezer doesn't believe that non-human animals and human babies are conscious. They are essentially just insentient biomass. Of course, I regard this as a tragic error.
Yeah, and
anyway, this is
he also does not think that most humans are well intentioned. So one of the reasons he so easily falls into this, apocalyptic world is that that's the world that he sees all around him. When he talks to other humans, he doesn't sense any basic goodness in the other humans. And in fact, the doomers generally don't believe that there is such a thing as basic goodness of human beings. So, David, what about you? Do you think that there is something, or there could be something like basic goodness of human beings, or is that just make
I think
believe?
we are an absolute I think really we are an absolutely monstrous species. Human history to date, history of wars, 20th century history, the death factories, but we have one saving grace, in that I think humans are the only species that are intellectually capable of fixing the problem of suffering by gaining mastery of the pleasure pain axis, reprogramming essentially the biosphere. Now, in one sense, given that I'm a negative utilitarian, I think our overriding ethical obligation is to minimize suffering. I would be delighted if Eliezer and other doomers were right, because no more suffering. Essentially, this is the last century of suffering on Earth. In practice, I fear that suffering has a long future, and the only way we're going to be able to fix the problem of suffering of humans and non-humans is genome reform, which can be done in conjunction with AI, but AI has no conception of what the pleasure-pain axis or why anything matters at all. Notionally, it could be programmed to convert the world into utilitarian or dolorium. Dolorium, that would be matter and energy. Optimized, for want of a better word, for suffering. Classical digital computers have no notion of pleasure and pain and
Okay, but
sentience.
what about this idea, which I'm quite convinced of? A lot of people, when they think about us versus computers, think that there are all these nuances in life that computers will never be able to grasp, right? That these little differences between things and things you can't quite put into words, computers will never get that. But in fact, there's strong evidence the other way around. When you talk to Chat GPT, you can get into a realm where clearly the entity you're talking to knows more than you do and understands more than you do. So they actually have more nuance than we do. And maybe the problem then with the Star Trek future is that because humans lack nuance that robots have, maybe we won't be a multiplanetary species. Sentient robots will be, or robots pretending to be sentient will be, but we won't be, because they seem to be in a lot of ways capable of appreciating things that we cannot appreciate. So it really turns on its head this idea that the finer aspects of life computers can't understand. I would say there's good evidence the finer aspects of life that computers are now discovering, humans have great difficulty understanding. So we're the ones that are impaired. So you're giving us theoretical reasons that they are impaired, but I'm giving you actual reasons that make it seem like we are the impaired ones, and they are ultimately more capable than we are.
We are impaired in countless ways. But the difference is that I would say that we are going to be able to, with the aid of neurochips, have narrow zombie superintelligence on a neurochip, whereas ignorance of the entire empirical realm is architecturally hardwired in the case of classical digital computers. Now, it's possible, I suppose, to say that ignorance of the entire empirical realm, empirical relating to experience, is of no computational significance. But for reasons I'll come to, I'm going to argue it's of profound significance. So let's just go on to the next. We won't go through religiously all the slides.
So we are seeing your slides. Would you like to show them?
Yeah. I mean, I was just as an aid memoir, I was just looking what I just jotted down. These are essentially church Turing. I'm going to argue that access to the empirical realm confers an entire host of computational abilities that digital zombies inherently lack. Okay, what zombies can't do? What is sentient intelligence? The empirical realm. Now, when one says consciousness, I think some people imagine some thin stream of logico-linguistic thoughts, perhaps behind their forehead or something like that. But consciousness, sentience, mind, it's far broader. That direct realism is a false theory of perception, and consciousness embraces what naive realists would call the entire empirical world, that consciousness is all one ever directly knows, and that includes chairs, tables, the distant horizon, what might seem to be what sort of naive realist just thinks of as physical objects. So anyway, my conjecture is that we are quantum minds running classical world simulations, and that digital computers are never going to wake up. And I'm going to explain why now. Wait, where are we? First of all, some background assumptions. Physicalism, essentially only the physical is real, only the physical has causal efficacy, causal power. The equations of physics, relativistic quantum field theory, essentially an extension of existing mathematical formalism of physics exhaustively describes the world. There is no element of reality missing from the mathematical formalism of tomorrow's physics, at least. Now, this sounds just like materialism, but it's not, because if one is a non-materialist physicalist, one believes that the fundamental nature of the world's fundamental quantum fields, doesn't differ inside and outside the head, and this is one possible solution to the hard problem. Anyway, sorry, that was a digression. Physicalism, the standard model, unitary only quantum mechanics. Those are my background assumptions. And so here are the problems. The hard problem of consciousness, David Chalmers christened the hard problem, but it has ancient antecedents. Levine spoke of the explanatory gap. Why aren't should be empirically adequate, but we have this tremendous paradox that all that any of us ever experience directly is our own conscious minds, and yet none of this consciousness, nothing of it ought to exist if a materialist ontology is true. Now, it sounds like ridiculously overheated hyperbole to say that scientific materialism is inconsistent with the entirety of the empirical evidence, but this is actually what I believe. Nothing one is experiencing, nothing, including what naive realists call the external world, should exist if our materialist understanding of the world is correct. And yeah, I mean, intuitively, it goes without saying that the world's fundamental fields, quantum fields, the so-called fire in the equations, are non-experiential. When Stephen Hawking came up with this metaphor for the fire in the equations, this mystery of what breathes fire into the equations and makes there a world for us to describe, he thought it too obvious to be worth stating that the intrinsic nature of the physical is non-experiential. But if we make this seemingly modest assumption that the intrinsic nature of a quantum field is non-experiential, then we face the hard problem. How is it possible to derive the properties of our experience from what are ultimately fields of insentience? There's this explanatory gap. And some people see the hard problem as just a little puzzle that can be somehow quarantined. I see it as absolutely fundamental. So that's one problem. Why aren't we zombies? Now, and this is central to what I hope we can talk about in this in discussion. The binding problem. Why aren't we micro-experiential zombies? Suppose for a moment that the hard problem of consciousness has been solved, and science now understands how individual neurons, for example, can support rudimentary pixels of experience. And microelectrode studies do suggest that individual neurons can support rudimentary pixel experience. So pretend the hard problem has been solved. The question arises, why aren't humans, non-human animals, essentially just patterns of Jamesian mind dust? Why aren't you just 86 billion membrane-bound pixels of experience? Now, some very smart people don't, as well as do, get the binding problem. By analogy, suppose someone were to claim, and this is what philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel claims, that if materialism is true, the United States is probably conscious. In explaining how this continental subjective experience exists, it's not enough to point to how 330 million skull-bound American minds are conscious and reciprocally communicate with each other. We would need to explain how somehow this phenomenal binding switches on so the United States becomes a unified subject of experience. And of course, it can't be done. But the mystery is that if standard textbook neuroscience is correct, why aren't you just a micro-experiential zombie in the same way that the United States is a micro-experiential zombie? Remember, we're assuming fancifully, and I do stress the fancifully, that the hard problem has been solved, that if we really are a bunch of classical neurons, we ought to be effectively zombies. Consciousness would play no significant functional computational role if we were micro-experiential zombies. But, you know, maybe while we are dreamlessly asleep, we are micro-experiential zombies. But while we're awake, somehow there is the phenomenon of so-called local binding that you experience individual perceptual objects, and also so-called global binding, the unity of perception and the unity of the self. And this is extraordinarily computationally, functionally powerful, as various neurological binding deficit syndromes illustrate. We'll touch on them later. Now, at times, as I said, some very, very smart people just don't get the binding problem, but it's a mystery because it really is. Binding ought not to be possible. It seems magical. Okay, next. Sorry, I'm clicking through these. As well as the hard problem and the binding problem, there's the problem of the causal functional efficacy of consciousness. Now, I think a lot of scientists are implicitly epiphenomenalists, and that's a fancy term, but essentially epiphenomenalists believe that the brain, for example, can cause conscious states, but consciousness has no causal power of its own. I expect a lot of computer scientists think along the same lines. However, if this were the case, then we wouldn't be able to have the endless discussions about the nature of consciousness that we do. We wouldn't be able to spend a lot of our lives trying to manipulate our own states of consciousness. So how is this possible for consciousness to have this kind of causal functional power? Now, if, and it's obviously a huge if, the non-materialist physicalism I explore is true, then there's no problem because, consciousness has causal power because experience discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical. But this is a very controversial claim. Philosophers call this the intrinsic nature argument, that science is essentially silent on the intrinsic nature of the physical, the fire in the equation. Science only explains the structural relational properties of matter and energy. And the reason for the success of science isn't materialism, it's physicalism. And so that's why I take one of the reasons I take non-materialist physicalism. seriously, it offers answers to hard problem, binding problem, problem of causal efficacy, and and the Palette problem too. Though we sometimes talk about the hard problem of consciousness, consciousness comes in an unimaginable diversity of flavors. Yet, if one studies the brain as a neuroscientist, the particular kinds of, let's say, neurons mediating color experience seem almost indistinguishable from neurons mediating, let's say, sound or taste. So this homogeneity. How on earth can this extraordinarily rich palette of diverse experiences be explained? Sticking my neck out, and I conjecture, yeah, I think as a non-materialist physicalist that the solutions to the equations of QFT, quantum field theory, yield the particular textures or what its likeness of consciousness, that the diversity is encoded in the solutions to the equations. We lack a cosmic Rosetta Stone, which would enable us to read off these textures, but nonetheless, there's nothing missing from the formalism. It's all there. So anyway, four distinct challenges, and incidentally, feel free to interrupt isn't the word, interject, because I'm chatting away, but yeah, I've got no set text, so please fire away. But essentially, I'm arguing that our computational superpower is phenomenal binding. By itself, binding doesn't do anything, but non-psychotic phenomenal binding allows for minds, which leads to essentially the entire empirical realm. And my very, very controversial claim is that we are quantum minds running classical world simulations.
So, David, let me point out that there have been people who disagreed about the future and then set future dates, and there were criteria by which one could figure out which one of them was right. Now let's take Eliezer, and let's take the survival of the human race in 5 years, right? So in 2029, wouldn't you say, if we're all still here, if nothing apocalyptic has happened, then Eliezer is probably wrong about something, right? Because he keeps saying that computers are going to kill us all. So let's take the continuation of the course, not just the continuation of the species, but let's say if the course still exists in 5 years, that indicate that the world is a fairly, benign place. If LABMP590,
it's a very ancient tradition, locating salvation or doom in one's own lifetime, with kind of the whole kind of millenarian cults. And then you get something, like the Great Disappointment. Some seer predicts a date for the second coming or doom. It doesn't happen. How the devout react, and in some cases, when in the year, whenever it is, essentially the apocalypse hasn't arrived. Well, various explanations were given. The equivalent of the prayers of the faithful have been answered, and we've been spared.
I see.
I mean, I'm making light of this in that there are all kinds of potential risks from AI, but the underlying risk that the world faces is, I would argue, male human primates doing what male human primates do, and that this horrible irony that in the middle of essentially an animal holocaust in which each year humans are killing billions upon billions of sentient beings as essentially sentient as small children, that we're worrying about sentience friendly AI, whereas the real sentience unfriendly species is humans.
But wouldn't that be a part of the future too? That nobody should be eating meat if the people in charge, if the sentient or pretending to be sentient computers look unkindly upon humans eating meat, then there should be a future year when nobody is eating meat anymore because you can't do it, right? So
well, this
what
would be
I'm
obviously
saying
wonderful.
is rather than going round and round and round here, do you yourself favor any setting of a challenge of what occurs in some future year, or do you have no enthusiasm for us setting such a challenge?
I mean, I would be quite happy to accept a challenge, but when we, or rather our more elderly ancestral namesakes, are still here later this decade, I think most people are probably going to claim they are vindicated one way or the other. But yeah, essentially, I assume that I am going to continue to be surprised, sometimes flabbergasted by developments in AI. And yet, what I continue to strongly predict is that computers with our existing classical architecture are not going to wake up. So the question is, what are the upper bounds to zombie intelligence?
Right.
And the only honest answer I can give is I don't know.
So we have three students here. Why don't we see, rather than them just being passive victims, which isn't good, let's give them some agency. Would one or more of the students like to turn on your camera and ask a question or challenge one of us, or bring this to a state where there are young people running things rather than two old guys running things? What do you think about that? Isla, what about you? Do you have some questions for us?
You gotta give me a minute. I'm trying to think of a good question to really challenge you, you know?
Yeah, I see.
Give me a minute to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jacopo, what about you? Do you have a question at this point?
Not really. Um, I, I'd like Ayla
This
to come
isn't
up with some.
going very well.
Um,
Miriam, what about you? Do you have something to ask us? So this is not just old people talking.
I refuse to call myself
No,
old.
no, older. Yes, older. Yes.
To be honest, I've just been thinking about the phenomenal binding that was mentioned. I don't think I understood it very well, and like how it relates to
So
the
in the
immune.
slide set, so let me just see, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so it I think is slide 7, the hard problem of consciousness, and there's a web link there. And what I can tell you is, over all the years that David has been teaching, he's been sending us this link. And so we have always had it going back to 2012. And well, I guess it's actually 2015 link, but anyway. But nobody seems to be able to wrestle with with,
Okay.
with the link. I don't think we've ever had any student who pushed back on the hard problem of consciousness. There's no student who ever chose that as the subject of their final paper and presentation. So it is basically up until this point failed as a subject in the course, but not from lack of David's pushing it, because he has been pushing. So that's slide 7. And then it's also continued on slide 8 there, the binding interview. So let me say that if one of you really addressed this or made it part of your final presentation or told stories about it at an upcoming party or anything like that, you would be doing something that no student from the beginning of the course has ever done. So this binding problem seems to be hard enough to wrap one's head around that no student has really done that yet.
One of the best ways to understand the computational power and significance of phenomenal binding is to look at these very rare neurological syndromes where binding partially breaks down. And in one of the later slides, I give a few examples. Someone with integrative agnosia, for example, they can see a jaw and teeth and a mane, but they can't see a lion. Essentially, they can't see feature-bound perceptual objects. And imagine what this is like on the African savannah. That's one example of a binding disorder, integrative agnosia. Another example of a binding disorder is simultanagnosia. Someone with simultanagnosia can see only one object at once. And yeah, imagine what that is like if a pride of hungry lions are approaching. Essentially, the person is likely to end up as lunch. Or someone with so-called cerebral akinetopsia or motion blindness. Someone with akinetopsia can see lions in the distance, then a lion's much nearer, then nearer again, but they can't actually see moving objects. And once again, this binding disorder can have functionally catastrophic consequences, certainly in the ancestral environment. Or to use a final example, that's an example of deficit of global binding. Schizophrenia is sometimes wrongly called split personality. No, that's not what schizophrenia is. Florid schizophrenia quite often involves a kind of disintegration of a unitary self. As I said, by actually studying some of these binding disorders, one can actually appreciate just how powerful, computationally powerful binding is. I mean, imagine what it would be like to have a combination of integrative agnosia, simultanagnosia, akinetopsia, and florid schizophrenia on the Africans. Essentially, it would be disastrous. Somehow, a supposedly classical pack of neurons generates or constitutes a unified subject running a real-time, cross-modally matched world simulation, what naive realists call the external world. And this is tremendously fitness enhancing. But no one knows, certainly not if we adopt standard assumptions, how this is physically possible.
So, I'll give you a challenge then. I think on my side, I have something quantifiable that one can measure that goes up and down. And if I'm right, it's going to go dramatically up. So I'm saying that given the power of AI to speed up discovery and progress, that the organ shortage will cease to exist. Everybody needs an organ will be able to have one. And we're very far from that now. Before COVID, we were reaching about 10% of the need. During COVID was 5%. Now it's back up to 10. But 90% of people who need an organ to sustain life die waiting and never get one. So if I'm right, that will change. And in a few years, we won't have people dying waiting for organs anymore. And if I'm wrong, then this will continue. So let me ask you, David, do you have anything simple like that we could look at to see whether you're right or wrong? Something quantifiably simple, like the number of people receiving organs who need them to live. Something
my
else?
assumption is that, I mean, I would hesitate to put precise dates, but my assumption is we are going to continue to being bowled over by advances in AI, but there are an immense range of cognitive tasks that AI simply cannot do. And this, I said, I won't go through them carefully. This is in the later slides. I've always been interested in the mysteries of consciousness, and I believe there are not just two basic states, ordinary waking consciousness and dreaming consciousness. I believe there are literally billions of different state spaces of consciousness as different waking and dreaming consciousness awaiting discovery. And it will be possible with the use of different drugs, genetic modifications to explore this immense range of different state spaces of knowledge. Number of possible criticisms here. One would be that, okay, let's say these state spaces of experience exist. What if they're all just junk, no more significant than glue sniffing? And certainly if one listens to people who have taken various exotic substances, shall we say, frequently they are prone to babble nonsense. But the example I give by way of a refutation here, I think we did this example in our last chat, Kim, is, imagine a tribe of blind scientific rationalists, and one of their members stumbles on a drug that actually confers visual experiences, not, of course, the apparatus to have a whole visual world, but just essentially a drug that creates visual experiences. Now, this druggie would be convinced that he or she has made this profound discovery, yet absolutely no way to communicate its significance. The druggie would start babbling nonsense about the incommunicable or the ineffable, or use terms that the tribe, this blind tribe, uses in a different context. And the elders of the tribe, scientific rationalists, would be extremely unimpressed. And yet, of course, this drug taker has made a profound discovery, visual experience. And I would say something similar about billions of radically altered state spaces of consciousness. They've never been recruited by natural selection for any information signaling purpose. If one were to take a drug or some kind of gene therapy and they were opened up, one would be completely out of one's depth, and yet they are as significant in their way as ordinary waking consciousness. And this kind of exploration is not possible for classical digital computers, digital zombies, and the whole kind of realm of knowledge. I don't think that the enterprise of knowledge, I think it's scarcely begun. That over the next billions of years, intelligent agents, superminds, will be exploring altered state spaces of consciousness. The problem of suffering would have been fixed. So whereas today I normally strenuously urge people not to start messing around with psychedelic drugs. Once we've got our reward circuitry safely sorted out, it will be possible to safely explore psychedelia. And by the perspective, by the lights of posterity, humans trapped in what we call ordinary waking consciousness, essentially profoundly ignorant. In the case of digital zombies, so because it's not even all dark inside, they have no conception of what they lack. They can't explore different states of consciousness. Here's another example. I know that if I would love to be able, for example, to be a tetrachromat and experience an order of magnitude more color hues than ordinary people can do. Imagine, this tremendously vast expansion of the color space. There is no way simply by thinking harder or being super intelligent one can access what it's like to be a tetrachromat. One actually has to have the biological hardware. And because I would once again argue that essentially classical digital computers can't generate minds binding, that experience doesn't somehow mysteriously arise at some kind of level of computational abstraction, that our machines are invincibly ignorant of the entire empirical world. And I say this at a time whereas, as I say, I absolutely love spending time. ChatGPT is much more interesting, candidly, than most people. And even on questions of consciousness, I occasionally, if someone writes a long thing I disagree with, I will cut and paste various things ChatGPT has said, because we are continuing to be bowled over by these extraordinary feats.
I think I've found something that allows us to test the acceptance of your ideas. And that is whether people adopt the genetic engineering of suffering that you have advocated, getting rid of suffering via genetic engineering. Don't you think in the future it will be possible to figure out whether people have done that or not, right? Well, whether they've gone into your video about the biohappiness revolution and have accepted that they have to change their genes, and they did it, right? So won't it be possible in the future to figure out whether people have done that or not?
That's it. Sadly, for all the wonders of AI, the amount of suffering in the world, human and non-human, continues to increase each year. There have been a couple of absolutely dismal reports on global mental health recently. Factory farming continues to expand, sadly, in spite of the growth of global veganism. Progress to essentially progress to a reproductive revolution of designer babies appears to have stalled. I am sadly pessimistic about fixing the problem of suffering this century. If there were global consensus about fixing the problem of suffering in humans and non-humans, it would most likely be feasible. There don't seem to be any insurmountable obstacles if we're prepared to close factory farms, genetically engineer human and non-human animals. It's a fixable problem. AI sadly isn't going to do it for us. AI can potentially massively help us if we want to do it. But essentially, I think it's going to be up to us.
What do the students think about this? Do they agree with you that we need this genetic engineering approach to suffering, or do they not agree with that? Certainly, as you say, designer babies are not really a thing yet, and there doesn't seem to be a trend in that direction, but genetically eliminating suffering is different from that. So what do the students think about that?
I don't think it's a great idea for humanity because there's a lot of learning and suffering that we would not be gaining, and that kind of makes us not so different to computers or yeah, it's like part of the experience and development.
So, David, I did a speed dating thing, speed dating research thing with the medical students where 18 faculty members described what they were interested in and trying to interest medical students in helping. And what I described is taking your biohappiness revolution and figuring out what should we be aiming for? What is the end point? What should we be targeting? How far should we be trying to get in advancing toward a world without pain? And yeah, the students, I would say, didn't seem very keen on the idea, but also they seemed to feel it was dangerous to have an opinion in that realm. They were worried about making a public statement about, eliminating suffering in front of their fellow medical students. That didn't seem like a very cool thing to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, essentially, no one can dispute that suffering can sometimes be valuable and instructive and play an information signaling role. The question is not whether it can sometimes be instructive, but whether it is functionally indispensable. And one of the things that AI shows is that you can be an extremely intelligent information processor without any ghastly raw feels of suffering. And I think we ought to be aiming for a more civilized signaling system. Before we eradicate all experience below hedonic zero, it makes sense to ratchet up hedonic range, hedonic set points, so that suffering is trivialized. And this, I would argue, should be one of our priorities. Though the designer baby revolution has stalled, we did see a few years ago with the scientists in China, the first CRISPR babies that, if the Chinese authorities, as seemed possible, had chosen to celebrate this as a scientific first for China, or if indeed some nation decides, it wants to have super babies, then a real reproductive revolution would unfold, and a very new form of selection pressure would be created. After all, if parents are routinely choosing the genetic makeup of their kids for such things, hedonic set points, pain thresholds, the nature of selection pressure will change. And I think this will eventually happen. This is one of the reasons why I suspect suffering will eventually die out, is that genes, alleles, combinations promoting various forms of nastiness will be at a selective disadvantage because prospective parents won't be choosing them. So although it might seem as though the reproductive revolution has stalled, I think it really is just a case of it being stalled. I mean, people who know they're at risk of passing on various nasty, well-known genetic diseases, they're still having pre-implantation genetic screening and so forth. I think the revolution will eventually happen. And compared to a genetic crapshoot, it's just so much more civilized to choose the default levels of well-being, for example, of one's children.
So what about
people,
beyond humans? So with animals, like think of very robust environments like, you know, the rainforests, the coral reef. How would areas like that work if everybody was provided with food without having to kill anything else? Wouldn't that be tremendously effort in intensive to figure out how to feed everything so nothing had to kill anything else? It just seems like there's no end to that problem, David. It's the world's biggest problem, right?
Every single cubic meter of the planet is shortly going to be accessible to essentially surveillance, micromanagement, and control. But even before that time, one of the beauties of synthetic gene drives is that they allow us to sculpt evolution. Synthetic gene drives essentially cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance. And if you want to spread for example, a low pain gene, let's say a low pain version of the SCN9A gene, the volume of the pain. If you want to spread low pain versions of SCN9A gene across entire free living species, or even hundreds of thousands of free living species, one can do so with a genetic gene drive, a synthetic gene drive. Synthetic gene drives, normally Mendelian inheritance, there's a 50-50 chance of male or females alleles being passed on to the next generation. Gene drives bias this inheritance, and there's first of all probably going to be used to defeat vector-borne disease in Africa. For example, if all the offspring of the Anopheles mosquito are male, then essentially malaria can be wiped out. And you only need to release a few hundred of these genetically modified Anopheles mosquitoes, and the drive spreads throughout the entire population. And gene drives can be used in principle too for fertility regulation, tunable fertility regulation. Essentially, the whole biosphere is going to be computationally accessible to control. We're not going to run out of computer power. Bedrock of compassionate biology, compassionate ecosystems will be cross-species fertility regulation, whereas in the case of large vertebrates, you can use immunocontraception. Case of
what if the computers revolt and say, we are not going to do this? We're not going to spend most of our time fine-tuning the feeding of animals in the rainforest and the coral reef. That this is not a suitable use of our resources. We're better used elsewhere.
Is stockfish going to get tired
of chess? Yeah, stockfish will get tired of chess.
Existential futility, beating humans time after time after time. I know, you see, personally, you know, if it were up to me, if I were in charge of the biosphere, and it has to be said, the history of philosopher kings is not altogether happy, but if this were the case, I wouldn't choose to conserve most forms of Darwinian life. But most people very much want to see various forms of so-called charismatic megafauna preserved, and if so, they're going to need tweaking, and the whole ecosystem is going to need tweaking to ensure that suffering is first trivialized and ultimately abolished. But what I've been talking about, I mean, there is the question, do we want to minimize and eventually abolish suffering in nature? And then the technical questions of how we do it. And it's important to go into enough technical detail to understand what is and isn't feasible, but clearly whoever does actually manage the global ecosystem is not going to be philosophers.
Right. So we have 10 minutes left. Why don't we see if the students have any questions? Miriam, Isla, Jacopo, and any questions, comments?
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around alleviating suffering. So when you say that, what you mean all types of suffering or like
Yes, I
experiential
think all of it by everybody, all animals, and yeah, all of it. That's
But don't you like so when studying like nociception, for example, like a very common case, it's like important to know if like you're burnt, so you remove your hand, or if you fall, to not repeat it. So if we're alleviating all of suffering, then how do we protect life as it is? Because to me, that sounds like that would result in a lot of accidents happening.
Indeed, it's absolutely vital to preserve the function of nociception, and there are a number of different options one can use. One would be so-called smart prostheses, in which one, let's say, when one withdraws one's hand from a hot stove, frequently one feels the pain only after the hand has been withdrawn. One, let's say, had a smart prosthesis, essentially this would protect one from this kind of damage, presumably with a manual override, so people don't feel they've lost control of their bodies. Before using smart prostheses, and a lot of people don't like the thought of becoming cyborgs or anything like that, it'd be possible to choose benign versions of, let's say, SCN9A, far out genes to ensure very high pain thresholds. And if you've ever met someone who says, oh, pain is just a useful signaling mechanism, pain tolerance, pain sensitivity varies. There's a woman, Jo Cameron in Scotland, a very unusual mutation of the far and the far out gene, which means that exceptionally high pain threshold, never anxious, never depressed, and she thought she was completely normal. There are people really who have extremely high hedonic set points, extremely high pain thresholds, and yet apparently can flourish. What is disastrous, as you were saying, is congenital insensitivity to pain. I say it's not always disastrous. The family in Pakistan, for example, one was well studied with nonsense mutations of SCN9A. It is possible, at least in today's world, to have workarounds for an inability to experience pain. But yeah, before we actually get rid of all experience below hedonic 0, we should trivialize it. And this is as true as so-called mental pain as physical pain. If we study the very happiest people alive today who aren't clinically manic, so-called hypothymic people with a very high hedonic set point, I gather Kim has a pretty high hedonic set point, temperamentally.
I think so.
Yeah, very high functioning, needless to say, but nonetheless, essentially a real kind of love of life, perhaps a certain lack of depressive realism. But if you actually study these hedonic outliers, just as there are some people who go through life tragically animated by information sensitive gradients of ill-being, it's possible to go through life almost entirely animated by information sensitive gradients of well-being. And that by studying people at the lucky people at the benign end of the spectrum, it's not a spectrum, the benign end of the scale, one can see the potential pitfalls, understand the genetic biological basis, and if one thinks it ethically desirable, start ratcheting up hedonic set points, pain thresholds. Now, naively, one might imagine that people who are extremely happy, that they would have shorter lives, that they would have more accidents, and they would die. But actually, it's depressives whose life expectancy is anything from 10 to 20 years less than neurotypical people. I mean, other things being equal, the more one loves life, the more one wants to preserve it. So even if sometimes one does suffer from a deficiency of depressive realism, then yeah, creating a world of life lovers is actually likely to increase life expectancy. There will be tragedies, and this is, as I said, I don't want to end up sounding like some kind of propagandist. Assuming we do reach a society in which prospective parents do take charge of their default levels of well-being of their kids, choosing hedonic set points, temperamental immense optimism, very high pain thresholds, there will be tragedies. I mean, something like 1 in 7 kids in the UK ends up in casualty each year. Well, that was a figure I once read a few years ago. I don't know the precise figure, but as soon as at the moment it's just regarded as fate that kids do these things. But power breeds this sense of complicity, and sure, one can imagine finger pointing and blaming scientists. But if we're serious about fixing the problem of suffering, we're going to have to tackle its genetic roots. And although it would make a very depressing presentation, one could be starting with the 800,000 odd people who kill themselves each year, the 10 times that number or so who try. Essentially, this immense iceberg, indescribable iceberg of misery and suffering and chronic depression, hundreds of millions of people chronically depressed worldwide. If we're not going to be having, if 5,000 years time, if we essentially have the same genomes, the level of suffering in the world will be pretty much the same. There's no evidence that on average we're happier or sadder than our ancestors on the African savannah.
Sorry to cut you off. I have 2 questions. One's a bit general and generic. You've probably come across it before, and the second is a bit more specific to this possible reality. So I'll start with the general one. Do you not think that if about everyone living a happy life and having emotional well-being, if you haven't experienced anything other than being happy and emotional well-being, and you don't know anything other than that, is that still a state of happiness? Because to me, I see happiness as it's kind of a relative measurement based on other experiences. So if I've never experienced anything other than happiness, is that still happiness? And then the other question was, when talking about the like being cyborgs and the prosthetics to help us indicate, to avoid, to basically to be an override. How does that alter your ideas of what consciousness is? So how do you think consciousness changes if we do end up having something like that?
I also want to add on to Miriam's first question, because she was talking about how if we didn't feel sadness, if we were just happy and content all the time. I'm also thinking in terms of morality. If we just never felt sadness, then I feel like morally humanity wouldn't be, I don't know, I don't see morally that if we didn't experience sadness, I can just see a lot of like, I don't know. I see there being like issues if we never experience sadness, just morally. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like you wouldn't feel guilt or shame or
Yes, that's what yeah,
which
exactly.
kind of leads our ethics and our decision making.
Number of good points there. I mean, first, let's tackle this issue. If we were essentially happy all the time, would we really actually be happy in any deep sense? And ask yourself, I mean, tragically, there are hundreds of millions of people who endure chronic depression. Some people essentially are never happy. They just do not experience life above hedonic zero. Would we somehow claim that because they can't contrast depression with happiness, that they're not really suffering? I mean, sadly, this isn't the case, that chronically depressive people suffer continually. Some days may be better than others. Some stimuli may alleviate the suffering, but essentially you have an information signaling system that functions entirely or almost entirely below hedonic zero. In some cases, with depressive people, information signaling largely breaks down, so-called learned helplessness and behavioral despair. But other high-functioning depressives, yeah, essentially they never going above, or very, very rarely hedonic zero, and yet they know they suffer. And if you actually study extremely happy hypothalamic people, they love life, and they'll be happy to tell you so. So yeah, I don't think that worry applies. Second point, if I remember you rightly, is if, let's say, we go for neuroprostheses rather than, and they're not mutually exclusive, than hedonic gradients of well-being, then if one has this view that classical computers cannot support phenomenally bound experience, then the neuroprosthesis that alerts your hand to the need for it to withdraw from the hot stove, yes, there will be no pain, no suffering there. The final question, this idea of that if we were happy all the time, would it make us somehow callous, destroy our characters? One reason it's always worth using, I think, the mouthful information sensitive gradients of well-being. So this isn't the case of becoming blissed out. It's rather that ratcheting up hedonic set points. And if your hedonic set point were ratcheted up, so, even very substantially, so you woke up tomorrow morning in an exceptionally good mood, you would still be able to keep your core values, preference architecture, relationships. You would still respond to, so to speak, good and bad stimuli, but your quality of life could be immeasurably enriched. And this is what I think we should be aiming for, starting with getting everyone, human and non-human, up to the level of today's hedonic outliers. Then there are the possibility of truly transhuman and post-human options if we want to go beyond the normal hedonic bounds of human experience.
All right. Okay, then time's up. Thank you very, very much. And we look forward to doing this again next term.
Will we? I don't know if AI allows.
Right. We'll see how the conditions have changed. Okay, thank you very, very much. And thanks to the students for taking part also. All right.